So let's talk natural disasters and conflict. What are the links? Who are the actors? And what are the structural constraints of those actors forwarding their political goals? So let's see. There are two contrasting effects that disasters can have. And I think before we focus on how disasters can make things worse related to conflict, I think it's also important and interesting to look at the other hand, how there could be opposing and contrasting effects. So, what ways can disasters decrease conflict risk? I could think of a couple of ways. One, disasters could lead to a rally around the flag effect. Often, when countries face these kind of large scale disasters, it can bring people together, make them realize their commonalities, not just their differences, and it could provide governments an opportunity to prove themselves and to unite the population around addressing some kind of large scale outcome like this. It could also reduce the capacities of groups trying to start conflict. If you increase absolute scarcity, it could make it harder for rebel elites to have the resources to recruit people to join their conflict. It can make it harder to keep paying soldiers to continue on fighting, which could leave people to have incentives to just go back to their homes and to stop fighting. So it could decrease both the likelihood of onset because they don't have the startup funds, as well as shorten duration because people just want to focus on going back home, helping their own families, and that kind of thing. It could also kill popular rebel leaders. There has been some research we haven't covered in this class that focuses on the importance of charismatic and unifying rebel leaders. We talked a bit about John Garang's role in the Sudanese civil conflict. He was an incredibly popular rebel leader, died in a helicopter accident in 2005, and the movement that he led and the ability to bring different factions together was hampered by his death. Shah Massoud in Afghanistan would be another example of a charismatic rebel leader, and the Northern Alliance never was the same after his death in Afghanistan. The Angola would be with UNITA would be another example that you can think of highly charismatic rebel leaders. If there is some kind of disaster in the group loses their leader, that could also decrease the chance of conflict because you don't have that unifying message or charismatic leader to bring people together. So these are a couple of theoretical mechanisms that could reduce the risk of conflict. There are, of course, a number of other areas in which natural disasters can increase the risk in conflict. We looked at two recent political science articles looking at how natural disasters can make conflict onset more likely as well as duration. Let's turn to each one one at a time. Disasters can increase conflict risk on the state side by reducing state capacity to prevent rebellion. That is because the state's resources could be depleted by them being destroyed or having to be used elsewhere to monitor or deploy for the humanitarian assistance mission. Either way, we've seen the importance of state capacity to preventing rebellion, either from a motive standpoint or just an opportunity standpoint. You can think of both mechanisms being at play in natural disaster responses. Related to rebel focused causal mechanisms that can increase conflict risk, the literature suggests a couple of different distinct ones. One is just the hard not to think about the pandemic responses of different countries around the world and how public support has been kind to some leaders who are seen as being effective. Jacinda Ardern would be one, and then countries' leaders who weren't as responsive. Think about Boris Johnson or Donald Trump. That states could respond poorly, which could lead to increased grievances against the state, or just the perception that the state is not fulfilling its end of the social contract, and so that could lead to increased conflict risk. It could also decrease, and relatedly, it can increase grievances against the state if the political leaders focus on certain parts of the country or certain groups and not others. That could lead to certain subsections of the population being dissatisfied with the state, enough to start a conflict. It also, natural disasters could increase reduce the opportunity cost to joining rebellions. Parents often are killed and leave orphans who might be easier to recruit. There's a whole sub-literature you might have seen in your other classes on child soldiers and conflict, what makes certain conflicts more likely to have child soldiers, either on the rebel side or the government side. Natural disasters would be one of those areas in increasing scarcity, which would reduce the opportunity costs for orphans or other young people to join the conflict. And there could just be increased relative deprivation between different parts of the country. One of the examples we saw with the prices of food goods in the workshops is, like in the case of Syria, if you're in the capital city, the price of milk was half the price in more periphery areas. And so it could be more expensive to get the basics, even within the same country, depending on where the goods are being produced and how easy it is to actually bring them to different parts of the country. With the Pakistani flood example, you can see swaths of the country being relatively cut off and having a more difficult time getting the basic essentials. That could increase relative deprivation, which could link to the grievances argument or reducing opportunity costs in that Collier and Hoffler cost-benefit analysis calculation. And the example, of course, that we've already seen in this class is droughts, where areas... droughts don't necessarily cover the entire country evenly. That can increase relative deprivation, which can increase the likelihood of conflict in certain parts of the country. So that's how disasters can increase the risk of conflict in general. A couple of photos of different places just with a surplus of water. Again, going back to Louisiana and New York, flooding has become an increasingly regular occurrence as the amount of water that's being dumped in certain places is either becoming less predictable or more extreme. Another mechanism by which disasters can increase conflict is through what we've already seen in this class, that it increase migration both within a country or across country. So disasters often produce mass migration. Droughts, slow-moving disasters, clearly, as we've seen in this class, could be a driver of mass migration, which could bring different groups in conflict with each other. Into the 2010 Pakistani floods, over 1 million people were displaced. And so mass migration could lead people to move and can create tensions in their destination state or just in the process of moving. I remember the talk of migration caravans in Central America in 2016 as being a driver of potential instability. Like with a lot of things we've seen in this class, there's often non-linear relationships between different variables. I mentioned in the previous slide how relative scarcity could increase, as well as there could be a decreasing, a pacifying effect on conflict if people just didn't have the resources at all to be able to fight. They were just worrying about their basic survival. And so you can think of a non-linear effect of scarcity and conflict, that those extremes in which you have absolutely no deprivation or extreme deprivation, you're less likely to be able to either have the motive or the opportunity to fight, but those in the middle that have some deprivation but also some resources to be able to focus on the larger political picture, that can make things more susceptible to conflict. And generally with wealth and migration, the same thing holds, that it takes some money to be able to relocate, to pay people to move, or to be able to move yourself, as we saw with the migration through the Darien Gap in Colombia and Panama a couple weeks back. So yeah, the poorest and the richest are the less likely to move, and it's the people in the middle who have some socioeconomic, cultural, or political resources to be able to relocate. And so that's how, again, you have that kind of nonlinear effect. One area that we haven't really touched on that much in this class, but is related to political security and conflict, is the unique role that the military and other state organizations that have capacity, often focused externally, can often play an important role in responding to natural disasters. Domestic and foreign militaries are often seen in those pictures, like in the slide I showed before with the helicopter, in providing humanitarian assistance. After the 2010 Haiti earthquake, over 20 countries sent military or government actors to help respond to the Haitian earthquake a decade ago now, from as far away as China and Qatar. I think one of the interesting things to note with this specific example was that the United States was quite close by, and they were able to get their military planes on the ground first and kind of took over the logistics aspect to it because they had the capacity and the control of the airport to do so. And with a lot of these disasters that can happen quite suddenly, having existing policies and procedures within a country to respond to it, as well as internationally to coordinate the many actors who want to get involved, can also be crucially important. There is a little bit of a literature. I have a working paper on how the United States military gets involved in natural disasters, and I got interested in it because of reading a lot of this literature for one of my grad student classes, and you see the role that disasters play, and you see the military actors. And after the Pakistani earthquake in 2010, there was a lot of resistance to allow the United States into certain parts of the country to be able to provide this assistance because of the threats, or perceived, or just optical, of having the militaries of other governments on their territory to be able to respond. And I mentioned in the earlier video about the Myanmar response to Cyclone Nargis. Different countries will allow certain actors in to be able to respond to disasters, or provide certain tools that could be seen as is useful or non-threatening to the sovereignty of different states when they get involved in disasters. This picture is from the Coordination Center after the 2010 Haiti earthquake. And there's been efforts in the last 20 or 30 years to increase the functional capacity of multilateral actors to be able to cooperate to respond to these kind of disasters. You can now take courses to train in disaster response, and the different roles and the different memorandum of understanding that different states and organizations have in order to facilitate responses to things that are both predictable but yet unexpected when they actually happen. And so I coded information about what disasters the United States declares, as well as the U.S. military's response to them, to try to get a little bit of information about whether the decisions to declare a disaster or respond to it is politically or economically motivated. And so I gathered data on the percent of disasters that the U.S. and the Department of Defense, which by declaring a disaster, the U.S. embassy in a particular state, like Haiti, if they declare a disaster there, that loosens up some money from the U.S. embassy to be able to spend to help in that state, as well as the Department of Defense can declare a disaster, which would also allow them to send resources to places that have natural disasters. So I used the disaster data from MDAT when they define a disaster as occurring and whether the U.S. also declares, and then the ones that U.S. declared and the DoD ended up assisting with. And you see quite a dramatic difference in the disasters on one extreme that happened, but the U.S. did not really declare or helped with in Africa, for example, as opposed to Oceania, in which you had a much greater number of disasters that the U.S. declared and assisted with than might otherwise meet that traditional definition. You have Asia as roughly equal. So you see quite a dramatic difference in spheres of influence and where the U.S. either had resources to be able to deploy and help, or thought that there would be reasons for or against actually declaring a disaster. A couple of other initial kind of trends from my data. You see that different types of disasters are more or less likely for the U.S. to declare, that you have U.S. much more likely to declare floods, storms, or other kinds of natural disasters, but very unlikely to declare disasters relative to their frequency for wildfires, volcanoes, epidemics, those kind of things. I would be interested to see whether that epidemic trend changes going forward now. But you can see the difference between slow onset and fast onset responses, as well as to what type of disasters the U.S. Sees as its role. I haven't seemed to see to what extent the Australian government does something similar. I'd be interested to abstract away. I've done a little bit on Japan. That is a similar kind of process, but not on the U.S. One of my main findings from that paper, and then we'll move on, is the fact that the U.S. is much more likely to declare a disaster in a country that it trades with. That you see on the bottom, the more total trade in dollar values as it increases and go to the right, the more likely the U.S. will declare a disaster, over doubling the probability between countries the U.S. hardly trades with versus ones that have direct trading relationships. It's a telephone call. I turned off everything else. I didn't put the phone on vibrate. A couple of other slides I had that I wanted to cover in this section. One is on disasters and conflict duration. State-focused explanations for the second quantitative article we focused on. Disasters can decrease state capacity to suppress rebel groups, going back to the Farron and Layton kind of approach, that they can destroy infrastructure. Military can be taken away from the battlefield in fighting rebels to be able to provide humanitarian assistance, and infrastructure can be damaged, as in the Pakistani case, that can make it more difficult to actually go into places to be able to exert control, and that should have on holding everything else conflict to increase the duration of conflict. That's from the state side. On the rebel side, rebel groups can evade capture and avoid defeat more easily because of either the chaos or the states don't have the capability to respond. They can affect the relative capability of the state and the rebels. There's been some evidence that as rebel groups become more stronger, conflicts last longer. Shouldn't be that much of a surprise. So the conflicts can change the relative capability of the different groups. And the areas in which rebels can control, if they can respond to a disaster and provide social services to people, that can also increase their basis of support, which would also increase conflict duration. So those are a couple of overview causal mechanisms linking natural disasters and conflict. We're going to be getting into them in more detail in the workshop. And there are whole other literatures on how natural disasters affect human security aspects more specifically, that in your research papers, if you're interested in moving forward with those kind of topics, I'm sure those of you have already kind of dug into that in more detail. Hopefully you can bring that to our discussion in the workshop. So these are a couple of overall causal mechanisms linking disasters and conflict, working through either the state capacity and ability to respond and their quality of their response, or through rebels, their capabilities, their ability to respond, or the grievances that they have about the state. Turning to the next section, I'm going to talk about the conflict in Aceh, the GAM long-running conflict that ended pretty soon after the tsunami in Boxing Day 2004 that we already talked about. And there's some videos that I would encourage you to watch. They give background information, as well as an intrepid reporter who actually went and visited some troops that were in areas that were affected. They were up in the highlands instead of down in the lowlands where some of their families were, and how they elected to respond. And then later videos, after people lay down their arms, the kind of follow-on effects that people face after conflict ends. We haven't seen that much of it, as well as whether there's the potential for a flaring up of violence given some of the causal mechanisms we've seen in this class and whether they persist. So watch those videos, and then we'll get into the case study of Banda Aceh after the tsunami.